And just to speak very briefly to the slavery issue,
All right, let's see it.
Leviticus 25 condemns by death the man stealing, so stealing someone and selling them into slavery.
So this is not Leviticus 25. This is either Exodus 21:16 or Deuteronomy 24:7, both of which prohibit the kidnapping of adult male Israelites, and neither of which is relevant to the question of slavery, because kidnapping was not a means of sourcing slaves for ancient Israel, and all nations that practiced slavery in this time and place also had laws prohibiting the kidnapping of adult male citizens. In fact, Exodus 21:16 is borrowing and adapting a law from the laws of Hammurabi. And while Deuteronomy 24:7 is a lot more explicit about this law prohibiting specifically the kidnapping of adult male citizens, the Covenant Code uses very careful terminology for distinguishing the different kinds of perpetrators of crimes as well as victims of crimes, because the punishments differ depending on whether or not it was an adult or a youth, whether it was a native-born Israelite or a foreigner, or an enslaved person who was a chattel slave or who might be a debt slave. And in Exodus 21:16, the term for adult male Israelite, ish, is what is used there. And this is why scholars are in widespread agreement that Exodus 21:16 is specifically prohibiting the kidnapping for sale into slavery of adult male Israelites. So again, this has no bearing on the question of slavery.
And the fact that the Ten Commandments are prefaced with, you are a nation who was slaves. I'm the God of Israel who brought you out of Egypt. So there's a fundamental difference.
That doesn't in any way, shape, or form whatsoever evince a fundamental difference.
And there's lots of literature on this. I would encourage people to read my friend Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster? He's written some excellent stuff. He's a leading expert in the field of a comparative analysis of ancient Near Eastern war literature.
So Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster?, is pretty pedestrian apologetics, relies on a bunch of apologetic presuppositions, and really only constructs arguments that are convincing to those who already agree and just want to be reassured that their agreement is valid. If you'd like a wonderful discussion of the methodological problems of his book, you can check out Tom Stark's response, which is called Is God a Moral Compromiser? And you can access the second edition freely online just by Googling the title. And Paul Copan is not a leading expert in this discipline. If you want leading experts in this discipline, I would start with Carly Crouch, who published War and Ethics in the Ancient Near East, Military Violence in Light of Cosmology and History. This is an edited version of her University of Oxford DPhil or doctoral dissertation. I'd also check out Sa-Mun Kang's book, Divine War in the Old Testament and in the Ancient Near East. There's also Warfare, Ritual, and Symbol in Biblical and Modern Context. This is an edited volume. And then Jacob Wright recently published War, Memory, and National Identity in the Hebrew Bible. And something you'll notice if you look through these books is that they never once refer to or cite Copan as any kind of authority, because Copan is an apologist. He publishes apologetics, and they operate on a lower methodological standard that does not meet what is required of critical scholarship.
Slavery continued on throughout the Bible with no problems.
It was always undergirded by the fact that this was not the ideal, that this was something that should not be done.
This is not accurate. There is no syllable of the Bible that suggests slavery should not be done. At best, the Bible expresses the feeling that it sucks when it happens to us, and there are no problems when it is happening to other people. And even if the Bible did say that this is not an ideal, this is something that should not be done, that wouldn't really differentiate it from the slavery as practiced by societies all around the world and down through time. Even in the pre-Civil War American South, many people talked about slavery as a necessary evil. That did not make it any less normative or evil. They just acknowledged that it wasn't that great. But we don't find that expressed in the Bible.
And even slavery within ancient Israel was fundamentally different than slavery around the ancient Near East. This is not a contested fact.
This is a laughable claim. There are no data that support the notion that slavery in the Bible was fundamentally different from the slavery being practiced in the societies around ancient Israel.
You can look at the scholarship of individuals like Wright, who's written extensively on this. He's an ancient Near Eastern ethicist.
So if by Wright, Wes here refers to Christopher Wright, then the reference must be to Old Testament ethics for the people of God. I'm happy to be corrected about this if Wes is referring to somebody else, but this is the only person I could find who meets the criteria. And if so, then I have two things to say about this. The first has to do with the argument for this fundamental distinction. Here's a representative paragraph in Wright's book. However, sometimes the differences between Israel's laws and those of other nations are significant. One striking difference in Israel's civil law can be seen in the laws on slaves. 3 Old Testament civil laws are quite unparalleled in any other ancient Near Eastern code. Exodus 21:20-21 and 21:26-27 take up the case of slaves injured or killed by their own masters. And Deuteronomy 23:15-16 grants asylum to a runaway slave. No other ancient Near Eastern law has been found that holds a master to account for the treatment of his own slaves, as distinct from injury done to the slaves of another master. And the otherwise universal law regarding runaway slaves was that they must be sent back, with severe penalties for those who failed to comply. Now, the discussion of these passages in this book is a little thin and does not engage with some of the concerns that have been raised by scholars. For instance, the law in Deuteronomy about the runaway slaves is agreed by the majority of scholars to be referring to slaves who have run away from foreign nations and foreign masters. It has nothing to do with slaves who escaped from Israelite masters, and this is more about thumbing the Israelite nose at foreigners than it is about recognizing and the fundamental human rights to enslaved folks. Now, the other 2 passages in the Covenant Code could be understood as more progressive laws about the treatment of enslaved folks. They are adapting and adopting Hammurabi's laws, but in the instance of Exodus 21 verses 20-21, that seems to be adapting laws from Hammurabi's laws that have to do with the treatment of socially equal folks. So there is a degree to which this has been altered to give enslaved folks some more rights. But if you'd like a look at how the Covenant Code is adapting and adopting Hammurabi's laws, David Wright's book, Inventing God's Law, is wonderful, and here's a table that shows how a lot of the Covenant Code is following Hammurabi's laws in order as they are adapting and adopting them. So we do seem to have a couple of laws that may be more progressive regarding the treatment of enslaved folks, but when we look at all of the laws about the treatment of enslaved folks in the Hebrew Bible and compare them to the ancient Near East law codes about the treatment of enslaved folks, what we find is that there are a couple instances where the Bible is a little more progressive. There are a couple instances where the Bible is more regressive. For instance, in Hammurabi's laws, which come 1,000 years before the Covenant Code, debt slaves only serve for 3 years rather than 6 years. So on that issue, the Bible is actually twice as harsh as Hammurabi's laws. But when it comes to the majority of the laws about the treatment of slaves, they're more or less the same. So this is precisely what we would expect from a society that is adopting the laws from another society. There are some changes made, sometimes in one direction, sometimes in another direction, but overwhelmingly, the laws are more or less the same. And this brings up the second issue that I have with Christopher Wright's argument. This is not critical scholarship. This is theology. This is imposing a unifying framework upon the biblical texts in order to make it applicable to us today, which means it's going to give priority to certain passages, it's going to marginalize, reinterpret, or ignore other passages. And I think Wright actually acknowledges that the Bible itself doesn't point to any kind of unique take on slavery. On the same page at the bottom, we do not find a section of moral law denouncing slavery, not even in the 10 Commandments, but we do find a moral principle operative within the civil law, which, when put alongside other Old Testament passages on the subject, puts a question mark over the whole institution and also sowed seeds that would eventually bear fruit in a radical rejection of slavery per se. In other words, the Bible itself doesn't reject slavery, but we can move around the pieces and we can create the rejection of slavery if we want. And this goes back to my idea that the notion of the jigsaw puzzle metaphor for the Bible is entirely false. It's more like a toy box full of Lego blocks, where you have the constituent pieces, which don't mean much in and of themselves, but you can put them together in whichever way you want to create whichever edifice you want. And so in this sense, Wright wants to argue that we have all the pieces in the Bible to create a rejection of slavery, even if the Bible never puts them together in that way itself. And that's really what's going on. But when we talk about this kind of slavery being fundamentally different, usually there's a comparison to pre-Civil War Southern American slavery. And usually the idea is that it wasn't remotely as bad as that. But that also doesn't actually engage with the data, because in the Bible, what we have is what's on the books, the law codes. We don't know how much those laws were enforced or even known about. In fact, most scholars would say they weren't enforced until in the post-exilic or even the Hellenistic period. So we are aware of the ideals, we're not aware of the application and how things played out on the ground. When it comes to pre-Civil War Southern American slavery, we're aware of how things played out on the ground, and we're usually entirely ignorant of the laws on the books. And there were laws on the books in all of the southern states about the treatment of enslaved folks. They just weren't enforced. So we can look, for instance, at the Civil Code of the state of Louisiana from 1825, the height of Southern slavery prior to the Civil War. And we can come here to Article 173. The slave is entirely subject to the will of his master, who may correct and chastise him, though not with unusual rigor, nor so as to maim or mutilate him, or to expose him to the danger of loss of life, or to cause his death. So even in the state codes in the Deep South in 1825, pre-Civil War America, there were prohibitions on maiming and mutilating and killing enslaved folks. They were just entirely ignored. That's not fundamentally different from what we have in the Bible. What we're comparing here is the ideals from the Bible to the facts on the ground from early America, when what we should be comparing is the ideals to ideals and facts on the ground to facts on the ground. But we don't have much access to the facts on the ground regarding how Israelite slavery played out. We have a much better idea when it comes to early Christianity, and that's also not going to play in the favor of apologists who want to assert that there was some kind of mythical fundamental distinction between the slavery of ancient Israel and Christianity and the slavery of the nations around them. There wasn't.
And there's vast difference between the law codes in Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers and something like the Code of Hammurabi, which puts people on a tier system and gives different punishments depending on where they are within society. That's not true in ancient Israel.
That's absolutely true in ancient Israel. Now, the laws of Hammurabi come from a much more socially stratified and complex society, and Israel was a much smaller and simpler society. But you absolutely see different punishments depending on the social status of the perpetrator or the victim. And we can just go to the covenant code. The law of the goring ox, for instance, suggests that if an Israelite is killed by an ox after the owner of the ox has been warned, that's the death penalty. But the family of the victim could step in and demand payment. If an enslaved person is the one who's killed, 30 shekels. That's it. Because they were on a different tier. And the same is true of all kinds of violence done to native Israelites versus enslaved folks. And even again, if we go back to the idea of kidnapping, both Exodus 21:16 and Deuteronomy 24:7 are just prohibiting the kidnapping of adult male Israelites. So yes, the same tier system was absolutely operative in the ideals that we find preserved in the legislation of the Hebrew Bible.
If you were a king and you stole somebody and you sold them into slavery, they would punish you by death.
We have no idea how a king would be punished, if they would be punished at all, because the legislation doesn't directly address that. And again, scholars are in pretty widespread agreement that this legislation was propaganda. It was used for scribal exercises. It was intended to structure power on the part of elites, and it wasn't widely known or enforced until much later in Jewish history. And we have narratives within the Hebrew Bible about kings committing crimes that should have resulted in their deaths, that didn't result in any punishment whatsoever on the part of the Israelite states. So no, these claims are not supported by the data. And if you would like some references for more you can read on slavery in ancient Israel, in the Bible, in early Christianity, and even the question of the abolition of slavery, here are some texts that you can check out. And I also discuss the question of slavery in the Bible in one of the chapters of my forthcoming book, The Bible Says So, What We Get Right and Wrong About Scripture's Most Controversial Issues. And the fit for this video has been 90s Nickelodeon cartoons.